Okay, we'll go here to share screen. And I'll remember to optimize for sound this time. Look at me learning here, getting better at this Zoom thing. All right, let's find our presentation. All right, so this will correlate with Explorations Chapter 5. And this will go into the topic of primate classification, taxonomy, and biological variation. All right, so first let's talk about what exactly is a primate. So essentially, how do we distinguish a primate from other mammals? Because primates, we are mammals, we're within class Mammalia, but primates are distinct from other mammals in several ways. So the three big ones, I'll say, the three big ones that kind of encompass the entire order will be adaptations that allow us to live an arboreal lifestyle. So that term arboreal means tree dwelling. So the suite of physical characteristics that enable primates to live in the trees. So there's going to be various forms of locomotion that we'll learn about later on in this chapter, in this unit. But for now, know that all primates have a suite of physical characteristics that enable primates to live in the trees. Humans even retain some of these characteristics. We also have dietary plasticity. So that's referring to diversity in diet, a diet's flexibility in adapting to a given environment. Now, of course, primates will generally focus in on particular resources, and we'll talk about that in more detail. But in general, primates do have flexibility. And when you think about it, that's extremely adaptive. Because remember, in the game of evolution, diversity always wins. So essentially, if we are able to have diversity in our diet, that means that if all of a sudden one food resource is no longer available, if all of a sudden there's a resource shortage, all of a sudden a particular fruit or vegetable is no longer available in our environment, we don't starve to death because we have the ability to then switch to other resources instead. So dietary plasticity is referring to a diet's flexibility, and all primates tend to have high levels of parental investment. So parental investment refers to the time and energy that parents expend for their offspring's benefit. So our offspring are born extremely dependent upon us for survival and reproduction. They're born extremely, they essentially, our infants are born so dependent that without us, they certainly would not survive. And that's true for a very long time. So it's not beneficial for a primate of any sort, especially not an ape or human, to have an infant every year or even every 2 years. It makes a lot more sense for us to have an infant every 3, 4, or even space it out every 5 years. Because anybody that is a parent knows it's difficult to have an infant, a 2-year-old, a 4-year-old, a 6-year-old, an 8-year-old. That would be extremely difficult to have our births stacked like that. So it's far more beneficial for us to invest a great deal in each offspring for at least 3 to 4, possibly even 5 years before having another child. That's a far better reproductive strategy for us as primates. So we are not R-selected, we are K-selected. So we have single births, and we tend to space them out at least 4 to 5 years. All right, so more about what is a primate. So again, we're comparing a primate to how do we distinguish primates from other mammals? So as far as the senses go, we tend to have an enhanced sense of touch and vision, whereas other mammals may focus in more on smell and hearing. We focus in on touch and vision. So primates have an enhanced sense of touch. The ends of our fingers and toes are sensitive and allow for maximum information from the environment. So our fingerprints and toe prints, those are the fine ridges that cover the ends of our digits. So digits just mean fingers and toes. So those ridges, those fingerprints, are intended to create that friction. Everybody rub your fingers together. That friction allows for finer absorption of information from touch. So these ridges enhance our tactile senses, increase the amount of friction, and provide resistance to slipping. So when you think about why that's adaptive, it allows us to have better grip as we're holding onto branches, as we're locomoting in the trees. Later on, it allows us to use and make tool technology. It allows us to take an environment from not just our fingertips, but our toes. I'm sure you've all experienced walking barefoot on the beach or walking barefoot in mud even. So it's not just our fingers. We're able to take in so much information about our environment from the ends of our toes and the ends of our fingers. So in addition, primates also have an enhanced sense of vision. So the vast majority of primates, especially the higher order primates, have orbits or eyes that are rotated to the front of the head, and they have an anterior position. So that term anterior means forward facing. So along with that, we tend to have overlapping fields of vision. We have excellent depth perception and stereoscopic vision, and we also see in color. Now, there's a couple exceptions to that we'll talk about here in a moment, but just know the vast majority of primates are going to have forward-facing eyes, overlapping fields of vision, depth perception, color vision, and stereoscopic vision. All right, so this is all related, at least in the beginning, to our arboreal adaptation. So as primates, we have most of us, except for the lower order Strepsirhines that we'll talk about here in a moment, but most of us as primates have a reduced reliance on the sense of smell and hearing and an enhanced reliance upon vision and touch. Most primates have lost the naked rhinarium or the wet nose. The only exception are going to be the lower order Strepsirhines, like the lemurs, lorises, galagos, and patos. So this is a black and white rough lemur that you see here in this photo. So the black and white rough lemur is a Strepsirhine, and it has retained the longer snout and also the wet rhinarium. So that's not true for most primates. That's only going to be true for the lower order Strepsirhines. So for most primates, smell is going to be a secondary sense. All right, I mentioned dietary plasticity. So dietary plasticity refers to diversity in diet, which is extremely adaptive and one of the reasons that primates are so successful. So primates will eat a highly varied diet. Most primates will eat a combination of vegetation, fruit, insects. Some primates even consume a small amount of meat. But primates will sometimes focus in. So this term folivivore means foliage or vegetation eating. Doesn't mean that they don't occasionally eat other things. It just means that the vast majority of the time they're eating foliage. A frugivore, just like it sounds, is predominantly fruit eating. So that doesn't mean they don't occasionally eat other things. It just means the primary component of their diet is fruit. Insectivores are going to be predominantly insect eating. So a lot of the smaller primates are insectivores because insects are like little small bursts of energy. So the smaller primates, like some of the lemurs and lorises, tarsiers, they can be predominantly insectivores. And then, of course, the omnivores. But actually, meat eating is quite rare amongst the primates. Of course, humans do it. Not all humans, but some do. And chimpanzees will also include some degree of meat in their diet, and some baboons. But just know that in general, primates have dietary plasticity, meaning flexibility and highly varied diets. All right, so primates have also evolved different dental specializations that we'll learn about in more detail later in this chapter. So we have 4 distinct types of teeth. The teeth that are in the front of our mouth, so the anterior dentition, remember that term anterior means in the front. So the teeth in the front of our mouth, the incisors and the canines. Think about when you're consuming something, that's what tears off that first bite. So your incisors and canines tear off that first bite, but what does most of the chewing? Most of the chewing is done in the posterior with the premolars and molars. So our 4 distinct types are incisors, canines, premolars, and molars. But molars are going to be the most telling or give us the most information about that primate's actual diet. So 2 of the types we'll learn about, there's bilophodont. So we find the bilophodont and the old world monkeys that we'll learn about here in just a little bit. So think bi, 2, dont teeth. So that means that their molars are very distinctive. They look very symmetrical to me, like you can almost divide them in half. So bilophodont is a particular type of teeth that you find mainly in the old world monkeys. And then Y5, so Y5 means that you can literally draw a Y in the valley of the cusps. The cusps are the little mountaintops on the teeth or the protrusions. So they have 5 cusps that you can literally draw a Y within the valley of those mountains. So Y5 is a dentition type, a molar type that we find only in apes and humans. All right, and again, primates have a really high degree of parental investment. Female primates give birth to fewer offspring than other mammals, and they tend to space out their burrs. So it's the most common for primate mothers to have a single birth and to space out those burrs at least 4 to 5 years because each offspring is born extremely dependent upon mother and their social group for survival. Now, there's some exceptions, of course. Some tamarins will have twin births, and it's not unheard of for other primates to have twin births either. It's just not very common. The most common occurrence is a single birth that's spaced out longer periods of time. And that's part of our adaptation because our offspring are born very dependent upon us for survival. It simply is more, it's going to increase our reproductive success if we can invest a great deal in a few offspring rather than have litters of offspring. So we have a few offspring and we invest a great deal in their development, especially because their development period is so much longer. All right, so, oops, sorry, this is information I already said, but parental investment, female primates give birth to fewer young than other mammals. So we are case selected, not R selected. We have birth spacing that can be several years. So birth spacing just refers to the amount of time between birth A, birth B, birth C, birth D, so on and so forth. So we can space out our births at least several years. Development period is related to larger brain size and increased intelligence in the primate order in comparison to other mammals. So especially for the apes will especially have a long development period because we have a very large, complex brain, and the regions of the brain require lots of time to develop. Humans have the largest brain for body size, so we have language, advanced culture, and social interactions. But as we're going to learn later on in this unit, other primates, not just humans, are also capable of culture, advanced vocalization, so on and so forth. All right, so some more characteristics that are kind of common denominators amongst the primates. So primates, we have a clavicle, so that's more commonly known as our collarbone. So the clavicle kind of acts as a strut to keep our limbs to the sides of our bodies. So it also allows for some primates to do this kind of motion where they're swinging from the branches, they're going arm over arm, swinging from branch to branch. The radius and the ulna, those are the long bones in our lower arm. So they allow us to do this motion here. They allow us to pronate our arm like this. The phalanges, those are our finger bones and toe bones. The phalanges allow for both hand and foot dexterity. We also have an opposable thumb, and also some primates have an opposable big toe. So opposable thumb has grasping abilities, and it also allows the digits to touch other fingers. So along with that, primates have a powerful precision grip, which of course is important to allow us to grasp onto branches. And also later, of course, to be able to use and make stone tool technology. Primates also have a distinctive spinal column with 5 different types. So the vertebrae in our neck, those are called cervical vertebrae. I have a picture of it here in a moment, but the vertebrae in our neck are called cervical vertebrae. So the way I remember it, if you have a collar around your neck, that's called a cervical collar. So we have cervical vertebrae. The vertebrae in the middle of our back are called thoracic vertebrae. The vertebrae in our lower back are called lumbar. So the way I remember that, if you're looking at a chair or a seat in a car, they talk about lumbar support. So that's actually supporting your lower back. And then the fused vertebrae in your pelvis, your sacrum, and your coccyx. All right, so some more characteristics that help us define a primate. So how are we distinguishing the primates from other mammals, essentially? We have a flexible, generalized limb structure that allows for various forms of locomotion. So we'll talk about whether or not traits are ancestral or derived. So think ancestral, older, derived, newer. So ancestral traits are those that are deeper within the order, that they define essentially every single primate within the order. The derived features may be features that only certain groups of primates possess. So all primates have the flexible generalized limb structure that allows for various forms of locomotion. There will be 6 types of locomotion or movement that we'll talk about later on in this unit. We have prehensile or grasping hands and feet. We have a retention of 5 digits on all hands and feet. We have an opposable thumb and big toe. We have nails instead of claws on all digits. The only exception will be some of the lower order Strepsirhines, and also the tarsiers will have a combination of nails and claws. But in general, most of the higher order primates are going to have nails instead of claws on all digits. And we have tactile pads, so our fingertips and toe tips that are enriched with sensory fibers at the ends of all digits. All right, so more features that help us define a primate. The vast majority of primates are what we call diurnal. So that term diurnal means active during the daytime. The only exception will be some of the Strepsirhines and the tarsiers are nocturnal, but the vast majority of all primates are diurnal. Primates have color vision, depth perception, and stereoscopic vision. So that's originally an adaptation for being arboreal. Color vision also allows us to distinguish between various food types. We can look at the coloration in fruit and vegetation to determine whether it's a good food source. Depth perception, of course, allows us to know where that next branch is. If you can imagine swinging from tree branch to tree branch, sometimes very high up off the ground, depth perception would be a very important adaptation for you. Stereoscopic vision is the ability to perceive objects in 3 dimensions. We also have an expanded neocortex. So that's the portion of the brain where information from different senses are combined and analyzed. So that's the frontal region of the brain where we take in information from vision, touch, hearing, sound, and it allows us to process and survive better in our environment. We also have the expansion of regions that are related to motor, cognitive, and sensory functions. All right, primates also have a prolonged gestation period. So that's the prenatal. That's the moment from conception to birth. So we have a prolonged gestation and also a prolonged postnatal as well, because remember, our infants are born very dependent upon us for survival. We have a reduced number of offspring. We have single births, and we tend to space them out at least 4 to 5 years. We have delayed maturation. That's delayed development. So it's talking about the postnatal period there, delayed maturation. We have greater dependence on flexible learned behaviors. We have a tendency to live in social groups. And sorry, that's a repeat there. We have a tendency towards diurnal activity patterns, so activity during the daytime. So we'll learn a lot more about a lot of these in the behavior chapter. We'll learn about how primates, not just humans, are capable of material culture, complex social interactions, a variety of different resonance patterns and locomotion patterns. But for now, these are just some of the characteristics that help us define a primate. All right, so here's just some photos of what we've been talking about. So the opposable big toe, so a chimpanzee foot versus a human foot. So chimpanzees not only have an opposable thumb, but also an opposable hallux. The hallux is the big toe. Humans have a hallux that's in line with the rest of our toes, which is a bipedal adaptation we'll learn about later. Those are the vertebrae types there. So in yellow, we see the cervical vertebrae. So remember the cervical vertebrae, those are the ones in our neck. The ones in the middle of our back, those are called thoracic. Our lower back, those are called the lumbar. And then the fused vertebrae, the sacrum, and then the coccyx at the bottom. All right, questions so far? Are we feeling good about how we distinguish a primate from other mammals? We're good to go. Okay. All right. So now we're going to get into even more detail. So now we're talking about how are we distinguishing the suborders, infraorders, and superfamilies. So we're getting into even more detail. So this slide here just kind of shows you, geographically speaking, where do we find primates? So the only continents where we don't find primates, I mean, of course, we see them in zoos, but the only continents where we don't find primates naturally are North America, except for humans, of course, Antarctica, and Australia. So we find primates in basically every other continent. So the prosimians, also known as the strepsirhines, they're found in mainly Madagascar. Lemurs are found exclusively in Madagascar. So there's a lemur there in Madagascar. And then we also find the lorises, tarsiers, and pottos in Central Africa and Southeast Asia. The New World monkeys, so the New World means the Americas, but we don't find any primates in North America. So we find the New World monkeys in both South and Central America, mainly in South America. We find the Old World monkeys, so the Old World is Africa and Asia. So it's not talking about how old the primate is, it's just talking about geographically speaking, where do we find them? So New World monkeys are found in the New World, Old World monkeys are found in the Old World. So Old World monkeys can include baboons and macaques, colobus monkeys, langurs, guenons, mangabes. We find all the Old World monkeys in Africa and Asia. And then the apes, both the lesser apes and the greater apes, we also find in Africa and Asia. So the African apes include chimpanzees, bonobos, and gorillas. And then the Asian ape the orangutan, the Asian great ape is the orangutan we find in Borneo and Sumatra, and the lesser apes, the gibbons and the siamangs, are found in Asia as well. All right. Do just some pictures here. All right, so let's look at the two suborders. So envisioning, and I'm going to draw the primate chart for you on the whiteboard, maybe not today, but next time. So I don't have to make you guys wait and watch me struggle with the whiteboard today. Since you already listened or already waited for me struggling with the quiz today, I won't make you watch me struggle with the whiteboard today. But the two suborders, so if you're envisioning primate at the top, so these are the two divisions that are going to go right underneath primate. So lower order primates are called Strepsirhines, also known as prosimians. I'll tell you why there's two different names here in a moment. But lower order primates are called Strepsirhines. Higher order primates are called haplorhines. So the Strepsirhines overall, now they still have larger brains in comparison to other mammals, but if we're comparing them to other primates, the Strepsirhines will have a relatively smaller brain. They do not have full postorbital closure. I'll show you what that looks like. So what I'm going to show you right here is a primate that does actually have postorbital closure. But if this were a lemur skull, there would actually be an opening here. So most primates, all the higher order primates do in fact have postorbital closure. So they have orbits that are completely protected by bony material. So the lower order Strepsirhines will have an opening here. They have a postorbital bar, that's right about here, but they do not have full closure. And the Strepsirhines, I'll show you a picture of that here in a moment. The Strepsirhines have lateral facing orbits. So that term lateral means slightly to the side. So that means their orbits or eye sockets are slightly to the side. They do have a moist rhinarium, that's the wet nose. They have a tooth comb, those are the lower incisors jutting straight forward. And they have a grooming claw. The higher order haplorhines, so that'll include all of the New World monkeys, all of the Old World monkeys, all of the apes, all of the humans. The higher order anthropoids or haplorhines are going to have a relatively larger brain. They do in fact have postorbital closure, so they have bony material that's covering and protecting their orbits. They have anterior or forward facing eyes. They have a fused mandible. They have a shorter snout. They have a dry nose, and they have nails instead of claws on all digits. All right, so let's look more closely at the Strepsirhines. So the Strepsirhines are the most primitive. They're the oldest of the primate order. So because of that, because they're the most primitive, they have retained some of those primitive characteristics. As we learned earlier, most primates are relying predominantly on vision and touch to survive in their environment. So the only exception is going to be these lower order Strepsirhines because they have a highly developed sense of smell. So they have an enlarged olfactory bulb and scent gland. Those are regions in the brain. Instead of only nails, they have a combination of nails and claws on their digits. And because of that, they have slightly less dexterity. So they're not quite as good at using and making tool technology. Geographically speaking, we find lemurs only in Madagascar. And then we find the lorises, galagos, and patos in Southeast Asia. So some examples of primate species that we consider Strepsirhines would be lemurs. So all different species of lemurs, ringtail, black and white rough lemurs, indries, shafakas, lorises, galagos, and patos. Those are all considered Strepsirhines. All right, so here's a better picture of what I mean by no postorbital closure. So when you're looking at this photo here, so see how there's a ring of bone around the eyes. We call that the postorbital bar. But if you look, there's this opening here. There is not bony material completely protecting the orbits. Now, if this wasn't a primate, if it was a raccoon skull, for example, there would be no postorbital bar. It would be completely open here. So even the Strepsirhines do have some degree of protection of the orbits. They just don't have as much protection as the higher orders, like the gorilla, for example. So as you see here, the gorilla has full protection around the orbits, and then the lower order Strepsirhines only have partial. So also their orbits have slightly lateral orientation. It's not completely to the side like you would see in a dog or a cat, but there is a slight lateral orientation to the orbits. The mandible, the jawbone, is not completely fused. They have the longer snout with the moist rhinarium. They have the tooth comb and the grooming claw. All right, these guys and gals, the tarsiers, the tarsiiformes are the ones that are difficult to classify. And that's why we have two different classification schemes. The kind of old school way of classifying primates was prosimians and anthropoids. So those that utilize that strategy or that classification scheme actually think that the tarsiers are more closely related to the lower order prosimians. But recent genetic studies actually show that the tarsiiformes are more closely related to the higher order haplorhines. So if you use the terminology Strepsirhine haplorhines, you feel that the tarsiers are more appropriately categorized with the higher order primates. So they are anatomically very confusing because anatomically they share some characteristics with the lower orders and some characteristics with the higher orders. So they use a form of locomotion called vertical clinging and leaping, which is actually more similar to what we see in the Strepsirhines. So they have long hind limbs that allow them to kind of bounce off branches. They have huge eyes that are adapted for nocturnal vision. They have the tapetum lucidum, which is actually part of the nocturnal adaptation as well, so being active at night. They have an unfused mandible like the lower orders. They have a grooming claw like the lower orders, and they have molars with sharp, pointy cusps. So that allows for a diet predominantly involving insects, so insectivores. So those short, pointy teeth allow them to break up insect exoskeletons. So the tarsiiformes are categorized differently depending on who you talk to and what textbook you're looking at. But know that what I'm testing you on is the newer classification scheme. The newer classification scheme considers the tarsiiformes to be part of the higher order haplorhines, okay? And because genetically speaking, they in fact are. All right, so it's just another picture of a tarsier. So you see the really huge eyes. And when you look at that animal, you don't immediately think primate, but they are in fact primates. All right, so now we're looking underneath the higher order haplorhines. So the suborders is what we talked about before. So suborder is the two divisions that go under primate. So the two suborders were the Strepsirhines that we just talked about. So now we're underneath haplorhine. So underneath haplorhine, we have the division Platyrrhine, Tarsiiformes, and Catarrhines. So we're going to talk more closely about just the Platyrrhines right now. So the Platyrrhines are the New World monkeys. So geographically speaking, we find the New World monkeys in the New World, which is the Americas, but because there's no primates in North America, we find the New World monkeys in both Central and South America. So some species that are considered platyrrhines: spider monkeys, squirrel monkeys, capuchins, tamarins, marmosets, howler monkeys, woolly monkeys, sakis, and eucharis. Those are all considered platyrrhines. All right, so anatomically speaking, so what are the physical features that help us identify a platyrrhine? So their nostrils. So obviously this wouldn't help if you're looking at a skull, but if you're looking at a live primate, if you see that the nostrils are side directed, if they have a broad septum and their nostrils are pointed to the side, then we know that they must be a platyrrhine. Their dental formula, so when you're dividing the jaw in half and counting each side. So this formula here is referring to incisors versus canines versus premolars versus molars. So in each quadrant, in each half of the mouth, so the quadrants, so there's half in the mandible and then half in the maxilla. So when you're dividing the mandible in half, for example, in each half, you would find 2 incisors, 1 canine, 3 premolars, and 3 molars. They do not have a bony ear tube. So that's skeletally speaking, if you can see kind of a straw-like structure leading up to the external auditory medius, or essentially the ear hole. So they do not have a bony ear tube. They have a special adaptation in their tail. They have a tail that's prehensile. So that term prehensile means grasping ability. So they're the only primates that have this feature. Not every single New World monkey has a prehensile tail. Most of them do. But it's only the New World monkeys that will have this feature. So if you're at the zoo and you see a monkey using his or her tail to locomote in the trees, then you know you're looking at a New World monkey. And they tend to have lower levels of sexual dimorphism. So we brought up this term a few times at this point, but just to review, sexual dimorphism refers to differences in overall body size between males and females of the same species. So we're going to start to learn, especially when we get into the social organization, reproduction, and dominance hierarchies, we do find that this is actually a really helpful trait to look at in primates, because low levels of sexual dimorphism tend to correlate with primate species that practice either monogamy or polyandry. And it also correlates with primate species that have low levels of competition. So these tend to, as far as sexual dimorphism and competition goes, they tend to be positively correlated. High levels of SD also means high levels of competition. Low levels of SD means low levels of competition. And of course, geographically speaking, we find them in Central and South America. So these are some woolly monkeys here. So you see how they're using their tails. Their tails are kind of sometimes called the fifth limb, because they're using their tails to help locomote in the trees. All right, so now we're going to the next infraorder. So just to review, underneath primate, we had the suborder Strepsirhine, that's the lower order primates, and we have the suborder Haplorhine, that's the higher order primates. And then we have the three divisions in the infraorder. We have the Platyrhines, we have the Tarsiiformes, and now we have the Catarrhines. So the Catarrhines are going to include all the old world monkeys, apes, and humans. So we're going to look first at the old world monkeys. So old world monkeys tend to be a combination of terrestrial and arboreal. So that term terrestrial means ground dwelling, arboreal means tree dwelling. Geographically speaking, we find them in Africa and Asia. So with the old world monkeys, there's two subfamilies, the Cercopithecoids and the Colobines. So some species that fall underneath this category include all species of baboons. So Hamadryas baboons, gelada baboons, olive baboons, macaques, mandrills, geladas, vervet monkeys, guenons, and colobus monkeys. All right, so anatomically speaking, how do we define a Cercopithecoid or an old world monkey? So now we're getting into the superfamilies. So underneath Catarrhine, we have the Cercopithecoids and we have the hominoids. So the Cercopithecoids, that's just the old world monkeys. So anatomically speaking, if you're looking at their nostrils, they have either forward or down directed nostrils. Their dental formula is a little bit different than what we saw with the Platyrhines. They have one less premolar. So that means in each quadrant, they have two incisors. So starting at the front of the mouth, they have two incisors, one canine, two premolars, and three molars. They tend to have higher levels of sexual dimorphism. So because they have higher levels of sexual dimorphism, they also tend to be more competitive for access to resources, mates, territory, etc. They tend to have more complex dominance hierarchies because of this. They also tend to practice polygamy as their predominant mode of reproduction. So that means that one male is mating with many females in the group. They do have a feature called the bony ear tube. So that's going to, you probably can't really see it very well in Zoom, but the bony ear tube is going to look like a tube that's literally leading up to the external auditory medius here. So that's the bony ear tube that you would find in old world monkeys, apes, and humans. They have a molar type that's called bilophodont. So thinking back to that picture we saw earlier, bilophodont means two lobes. So their molars are divided into two predominant lobes. Their thorax, their mid-region, tends to be more narrow. Many Cercopithecoids will have a tail, but it is not prehensile. So there's no grasping ability to that tail. They have a feature on their rear ends called the ischial callocytes. So those are tough sitting pads or tough calluses on the rear. And that's an adaptation that allows for long-term sitting in very hot environments. So many of the Cercopithecoids are more terrestrial than they are arboreal. So they have this adaptation that allows them basically to sit on a hot substrate in a really, for a really prolonged period of time. And they tend to be the most diverse and successful of the non-human primates. So this picture here, the red rear ends here, those are the ischial callocytes. Those are the butt calluses. Their noses, so their noses tend to be more narrow, and it's separated by a septum that points downward. So this is a mandrill right here. So you see the very narrow septum and the forward-facing nostrils here. So side-directed would mean Platyrhine, forward or down-directed would mean Cercopithecoid or Catarrhine. Most diverse and most successful of the non-human primates. Tough sitting pads on the rear, and also higher levels of sexual dimorphism. All right, so these pictures are just some examples of primate species that we consider Cercopithecoids or old world monkeys. We've got the black and white colobus monkeys here. So you see they have a very long tail, but they're not using it for anything. Their tail is just kind of hanging out. So it's a non-prehensile tail. This is a great langur here. This is a proboscis monkey with a very unique looking nose. They also have a chambered stomach, much like a cow would, because they're predominantly folivores. The dock langur, the mandrill, which is a type of baboon, de Brazza's monkeys, olive baboons, and those are just a few examples. There's a wide variety of different old world monkeys. All right, questions so far? So this slide here, this one's showing you the New World monkeys and the Old World monkeys right next to each other. So the New World monkeys, now this is comparing them to one another. So compared to the Old World monkeys, and New World tend to have a smaller body and brain. Geographically speaking, they're found in South and Central America. They tend to be mainly arboreal. Now, that doesn't mean they don't occasionally come down to the ground. Of course they do, but they tend to spend more time in the trees than the Old World monkeys do. Their anatomical features, they have a prehensile tail. They have rounded nostrils that point to the side. They have lower levels of sexual dimorphism, so they tend to be less competitive and more cooperative. And they're highly social and group-oriented. The Old World monkeys have a larger body and brain in comparison to the New Worlds. Geographically speaking, we found them in Africa and Asia. They tend to be more terrestrial. Now, that doesn't mean they don't occasionally go in the trees, but it just means they spend more time on the ground. Anatomically speaking, they have the ischiocalycytes, the tough butt pads, the tough calluses on the rear. They have nostrils, their septum is more narrow, and their nostrils point either forward or downward. They have higher levels of sexual dimorphism, so they tend to be more competitive for access to food, resources, territory. And they tend to be highly social, group-oriented, with complex reproductive strategies. And then, of course, our dental formula, if you're looking at skeletal and dental evidence, an easy way to tell apart the New World and the Old World is to simply look at their dental formula. So the New Worlds will have 2 incisors, 1 canine, 3 premolars, and 3 molars in each quadrant, whereas the Old Worlds, apes and humans, will have 2 incisors, 1 canine, 2 premolars, and 3 molars. So they essentially have the Old Worlds have 1 less premolar. All right, now let's look at Hominoidea. So Hominoidea is us. Hominoidea is the lesser and greater apes and also humans. So in general, unless we're talking about the lesser apes are the smaller apes. Generally, the great apes and humans, of course, have a larger body size. They're going to have the largest relative brain size. So that means our brain is the largest in comparison with our body. For those that either brachiate or use knuckle walking, they're going to have arms that are longer than legs. Now with humans, it's going to be the opposite. But just for now, know that the apes that use brachiation and knuckle walking are going to have arms that are longer than their legs. Because they have a larger brain and longer development period, they have more complex brains and enhanced cognitive abilities. They have increased periods of infant development and dependency. They have a Y5 molar pattern, and they do not have a tail. All right, so the lesser apes only include 2 species. The lesser apes are the gibbons and the siamangs. So they are the most skilled brachiators. So brachiation is a form of locomotion that we'll look at in more detail soon. But for now, know that brachiation is this movement like this. So you're using your arms to swing from branch to branch. So those that are brachiators have extremely long arms. So they're 4-limb dominated. The 4 limbs are the arms, the hind limbs are the legs. So they are 4-limb dominated. They have curved finger bones, curved phalanges. They have really powerful shoulder muscles. And amongst the primate order, they're amongst one of the only ones that are monogamous. So as we'll learn in the next chapter, polygamy and polyandry are much more common than monogamy is amongst the primate order. Now, of course, it exists in the lesser apes and of course some humans, but it's just simply not the most common strategy. All right, now the great apes include 4 species. So we're still underneath superfamily Hominoidea. The great apes include orangutans, so that's the Asian ape. There's the Bornean orangutan and the Sumatran. And then the Asian ape, or the African apes, excuse me, African apes are 3 species, the chimpanzees, bonobos, and gorillas. So the sagittal crest, that's a unique feature that you find in male gorillas and orangutans. So it kind of looks like this bony mohawk running down the center of the skull. So this feature here, the sagittal crest, is actually the attachment point for the jaw muscles. So for a gorilla, the jaw muscles actually start here on the ramus, which is part of the mandible. They tuck underneath the zygomatic bone, which is the cheekbone, and then they go all the way up and attach all the way up here. So for comparison, the jaw muscles of a human, they stop just kind of right above our ears, okay? So the reason for that feature is actually a dietary adaptation, because gorillas are predominantly folivores, predominantly vegetarian. And think about it for a moment, chewing vegetation, chewing raw spinach, raw lettuce, raw cucumbers, raw carrots. You guys get the picture. Raw vegetation actually takes quite a bit of chewing force. And gorillas have an extremely large body size. Male gorillas are sometimes over 400 pounds, female gorillas about 200, 250. So extremely large body plan, and they're consuming a relatively low calorie food item. So gorillas generally spend about 50% of their hours awake just chewing on vegetation. So that requires a really powerful jaw. So the sagittal crest here, at least if you're looking at it in a primate, the sagittal crest usually indicates the need for a lot of chewing force, okay? It's also a sexually dimorphic trait. The sagittal crest in a male gorilla is very pronounced, and in a female gorilla, it's either very slight or even absent. All right, chimpanzees, at least among the primate order, chimpanzees and humans are the only ones that are really considered omnivorous. So that means they don't only eat vegetation, fruit, insects, they also include some degree of meat in their diet. And then we'll learn later, humans are characterized by a skeletal structure that is adapted for bipedalism. So bipedalism, we'll learn in a future chapter, is actually the hallmark or the original characteristic that separates us from the other apes. All right, so now we're going to look at each ape species in a little more detail. So I kind of divided these up in species for you guys for the great apes, just because these are the ones that are genetically speaking the most closely related to us. And this is a class about humans. So of course, we're the most interested in those that are the closest to us. Not that the others aren't important. All right, so the orangutan. The orangutan is the Asian ape. The name orangutan means wise man of the forest. They're found exclusively in Borneo and Sumatra. They tend to be mainly arboreal. So they spend the vast majority of their time in the trees. They tend to consume mainly fruit. They have very high levels of sexual dimorphism. Males are generally about 200 pounds. Females are generally less than 100. So when you think about that, males are double, sometimes more than double the size of females. And if you think about that in comparison to humans, males are certainly not double the size of females. And we're going to learn, unfortunately, many of the great apes are severely threatened due to habitat loss. So for the orangutans, it's due to poaching, habitat loss, palm oil production, coffee cultivation, and wood pulp cultivation. Palm oil is one of the predominant reasons that the orangutan is critically endangered. So one thing that you can do if you're interested in helping conserve these animals, is just take a look at the products you use on a day-to-day basis. I've got some lotion here. Like you can look at your lotion or whatever, whatever beauty product, and just look at the ingredients and make sure that it doesn't contain palm oil. So I know that's one thing that I do as an individual, trying to do my very best to make sure that we reduce our reliance on palm oil. All right, so gorillas. So there's different species of gorillas, or subspecies, I should say. There's the Western lowland gorilla, Eastern lowland gorilla, and the mountain gorilla. So gorillas are found in the forests of equatorial Africa. So that's mainly the Congo region and Uganda. They are the largest of all the living primates. Male gorillas are about 400 pounds. Females are somewhere between 150 to 200 pounds. So again, just like the orangutan, they have a very large level of sexual dimorphism, with the males being double the size of females. They're also unfortunately, extremely critically endangered. There's only about 125,000 Western lowland gorillas left, only about 12,000 Eastern lowland gorillas left, and only about 700 mountain gorillas left. So they also have a very unique structure to the way that they organize. It's really gorillas and baboons that structure their social hierarchies this way. They live in harems, or one male, multi-female groups. So there will be a dominant, sometimes called the silverback male, the dominant silverback male, and then all the females and dependent offspring. So that one male will mate with all of the females in that given group. And like I mentioned before, gorillas are predominantly folivores or vegetarians. So that's why we have that feature of the sagittal crest, because they need very powerful jaw muscles to chomp up that vegetation. All right, chimpanzees, anatomically speaking, are very similar to gorillas, but behaviorally they are very different. They tend to be more arboreal. They tend to be less sexually dimorphic than both the gorillas and the orangutans. They have various forms of locomotion. They can be knuckle walkers, so they're walking literally on their knuckles when they're quadrupedal. They can also brachiate for short periods of time. So brachiation is that form of locomotion where they're swinging their arms from branch to branch. And they can be bipedal for short periods of time. But anybody that's ever watched a chimpanzee in bipedal locomotion knows that it's not quite as elegant. I mean, not that we're always elegant, but when a chimp walks bipedally, it seems a little bit awkward. And generally when they're walking bipedally, it's because they're carrying something, whether it be food or infants, or predominantly when they're using a tool. And they're omnivorous, just like humans. They have hunting and meat sharing behaviors that we'll learn about more in the next chapter. And their groups can range wildly. Like sometimes during certain seasons, actually, they live in smaller groups. We call that fish infusion. So during periods of resource shortages, they live in smaller groups and they go off in these smaller hunting and gathering groups. And then when they have more plentiful resources, they come back together in groups of about 100 individuals. And they tend to be pretty competitive and pretty, they can be kind of brutal. Chimpanzees oftentimes will engage in infanticide. They also sometimes have combat between groups, so they can be a little bit brutal. Bonobos were once thought to be just pygmy chimpanzees, or essentially smaller chimpanzees, but we now know, genetically speaking, that they are a distinct subspecies. So the bonobos have, there's about 30,000 to 50,000 left in the wild. Further studies show that bonobos are not actually that much smaller. They're just more gracile, so they're more delicately built. And they also tend to be more arboreal than the chimpanzees. And they organize their sexual hierarchy and their dominance hierarchy completely differently, where chimpanzees tend to be very male-dominated and patriarchal. The bonobos are the opposite. Bonobos are very peaceful, and the females actually tend to be dominant. So they actually use sex to negotiate their dominance. Their copulations are frequent and occur outside of a female's estrus cycle, so they're not used just for reproductive values. They have sex for reasons other than just reproduction. They use sexual encounters to diffuse tensions and negotiate dominance hierarchies within the group. Same-sex pairings are also common. So the bonobos we'll learn more about in the behavior and reproduction unit, of course, but they're a fascinating group of primates because they actually organize their social structures in a very different way, and they use sex to negotiate dominance. All right, so what I want to do, I want you guys to go into your breakout rooms for a little bit. So let me go here, stop share, and I'll go ahead and stop the recording for a little bit.